Hi, my name is Mike Doran. I'm a Senior Fellow and the Director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. And today we are having an event on the state of play between the United States and the Middle East 1 month after President Biden's visit to the region. And I'm joined by three very distinguished fellows, two of them my colleagues from the Hudson Institute, Rob Greenway and Jonathan Schachter, and one from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Andrea Stricker. Okay, Andrea, if it's okay with you, I'd like to get your opinions to get us rolling. We're just for the benefit of our viewers, we are recording this on Monday afternoon. The news has just come out that Iran may or may not be responding to the offer by the P5+1 that it received last week. It will be responding by midnight tonight, Monday. So it's possible that we could be waking up tomorrow morning to news that the world powers and Iran are returning to a nuclear agreement. Whether that happens or whether it doesn't happen, we have a pretty good idea already of what the contours of that agreement are going to be. I wonder if you could just give us a sense from a technical nuclear point of view of what you're looking at.
Sure, and thank you for the great introduction, Mike, and for hosting. I know at FDD we really appreciate all the great work that all of you do. Just a quick note, I'm going to stay off camera. I just had an eye procedure, and I know that it still seems to frighten small children, so I'll stay hidden so we can focus. But with that, Iran's nuclear program, it's been advancing quite rapidly under President Biden's watch. Now he's talking about re-entering this expiring nuclear accord. So I think it's good to go over some of the advances that they've taken since the original accord. The regime appears to be exploiting the administration's willingness to lift sanctions and negotiate the JCPOA's return. I believe it's either buying time by drawing out the talks to make additional nuclear advances and doesn't plan to make a deal, or it's just waiting for an extreme amount of concessions to re-enter this accord when the deal will be too good to pass up. So since Biden has been in office, they've enriched uranium to 60%. That's the highest purity they've ever achieved, and a technical stone's throw from 90% or weapons grade. They have enough enriched uranium overall to make more than 5 nuclear weapons. And they plan to install at least 1,500 of their faster advanced centrifuges at highly fortified underground sites. They're also working on nuclear weaponization aspects out in the open. They made uranium metal, which is a material used in the core of a nuclear weapon. And then they've been reducing International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, monitoring of many of their activities, while openly extorting the IAEA for access to camera footage and safeguards data. So now they're threatening that they're close to the nuclear threshold. And I think that threat coming from senior Iranian officials, we take that to mean that they're saying they're very close to atomic weapons. Even though they claim that this program is peaceful, at the same time they're making these threats that they're able to step over this threshold. We take that to mean that they're very close and they could do so without being stopped. Whether or not that's true, we could debate. Probably they're not right there yet where they could take the final step so quickly that we couldn't stop them. But I think it's worth heeding the warning from the Institute for Science and International Security, the good ISIS. They think that Iran could detonate a crude nuclear explosive in a test within 6 months, while timelines are longer to put it on a missile. You mentioned that Iran has a deadline of tonight to answer whether it will rejoin this deal. I'm not sure the European Union really plans to enforce that deadline. Iran doesn't like these sorts of deadlines, so I would expect them to blow by it. But one of the most troubling concessions we've heard that the Wall Street Journal reported last week is that the European Union is offering to close a separate IAEA safeguards investigation related to Iran's non-compliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in order to re-implement the JCPOA. And the IAEA's Board of Governors previously did this in 2015 in order to pave the way for the original deal's implementation. So I think that's a huge warning sign that we have major concessions ahead and we'll never probably get answers about Iran's NPT violations. So I think that's in a nutshell where things stand on the nuclear side.
That's beautiful. Before I move on to our colleagues, Andrea, can I just ask you a few follow-up questions?
Yes.
First of all, can you just define for us what we mean when we say, or what you mean when you say a nuclear threshold state?
Sure. My colleague Anthony Ruggiero and I have been looking at this, and we think of it as they have all the technical abilities to take the step to make atomic weapons before being stopped. Essentially, if they diverted enriched uranium from their enrichment plants, we couldn't bomb it in time. We couldn't stop their centrifuge production facilities, which they've taken deeper and deeper underground and fortified against aerial strikes. I think there's still time to act, even with economic penalties, in order to deter them from taking that final step across the threshold. But the window's getting shorter as we waste all this time with the talks and not getting them to meaningfully restrain their activities.
And the other question I wanted to ask you is about their NPT violation. Can you just, you said that this is a warning sign, the fact that they are not coming clean on to the IAEA about the evidence of their violations of the NPT. But can you explain to us why this is a separate or more severe warning sign than from some of the other ones that we've always been noting?
Sure. So the IAEA has investigated Iran's nuclear program since 2002, since there were international revelations that it was building clandestine nuclear facilities. In 2015, the world powers agreed to close this probe before it was finished, and Iran had truthfully answered and come clean about it in order to implement the JCPOA. So that the investigation was removed from the IAEA's agenda and its active investigations. But in 2018, the Israeli Mossad, they stole an archive of Iran's nuclear files from a warehouse in Tehran. And this showed photographic evidence, technical planning, plans for nuclear weapons production facilities that were under construction, all up until 2003, when it seemed that the spotlight of the international attention, the US presence in Afghanistan and Iraq, propelled them to downsize, to not produce nuclear weapons, but decide to continue progressing their ability to do so quietly and more covertly. Now, the IAEA is investigating some of the sites named in this archive, and it asked Iran for access to 3 sites in 2019 and 2020. And Iran delayed on a couple of them. They removed evidence, they sanitized the sites. The IAEA wants to know the reason for the presence of uranium that it detected and where it is today, because this has to do with Iran complying with the NPT, and it's required to declare where it's producing nuclear material and explain those activities. And that's a fundamental legal obligation separate from a political agreement like the JCPOA. So we risk that Iran won't explain what it was doing. We risk not being able to figure out if they have ongoing activities today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Rob, let's turn to you next, and I'd like to get your analysis of what you think the Biden administration is doing. Well, let me put it to you this way. I think that Andrea mentioned being very, very careful not to go beyond the facts. She said that the EU made this proposal to, and these are not her words, kneecap the IAEA last week. My own feeling is that the EU wouldn't have done this without a green light from the United States. And in fact, since the proposal was put forward, we haven't heard any sign from Washington that there's discomfort with this. What do you think is happening here? I mean, we have the step taken by the EU. In addition to that, then we have Salman Rushdie is attacked by a man who seems to be at least inspired by the teachings of the Ayatollah Khomeini and the calls against Salman Rushdie. We've had attacks on a number or plots against a number of Americans, including former officials in the Trump administration, by the Iranian regime. And I'm just as we're going to air right now, I saw on the news that that our Special Operations Force or base in Atanf in Syria was attacked by Iranian affiliated militias in Iraq, reportedly. No sign whatsoever that the United States is going to move away from these concessions to Iran in the nuclear arena. How do you think that the administration is framing all of this? And why do you think they're doing it? And what do you think the consequences of? All in 5 minutes, Rob.
I better get started. First, thanks for the opportunity to speak with all of you today, and appreciate Andrea's, as always, expert laydown of the current landscape. Look, let me start first with how the region perceives U.S. approach, because I think at the end of the day, that's equally important. There is, I think, without belaboring it, there is an intrinsic conflict in the current U.S. approach. In the one hand, we are hell-bent on return to the JCPOA. We're not enforcing our sanctions as a result of it, and incentivizing the wholesale relief of a full range of sanctions, including those beyond the scope of Iran's nuclear program and outside the scope of the JCPOA, those that relate to terrorism specifically and the IRGC in particular, who as you mentioned, are responsible for many of the incidents you just mentioned in just the past few weeks. And this has led our regional partners to be confused and frustrated, because on the one hand, we're feeding the greatest risk to their regional stability and their prosperity, and at the same time, in their view, abandoning them in many ways to their own devices without U.S. support to reconcile. And so this intrinsic conflict between the U.S. approach to create a problem and not necessarily to deal with the entirety of it has eroded the trust and confidence in our partners and allies in the region. And this obviously is a problem. Now, the result of this, of course, is our partners are seeking to diversify their dependency on the United States to meet their security concerns relative to Iran. And this pushes them further and further away from the United States and closer to China and Russia, which will come at our and, frankly, their expense. And they don't want to do this, to be upfront, and it's why they haven't up to this point, but they feel that they don't have an alternative. Now, again, this is really not the time to do it as we recover from a pandemic. The global economy is edging towards or in recession, depending on whose expert opinion you believe. And in any case, there's historic disruptions to global energy markets and food supply and the global supply chain. All of that is at risk because of our current approach. Now, at the end of the day, in terms of negotiations, like I would judge the administration believes, and this is all about belief. Actions are always based on some sort of belief. There's a belief that if we increase Iran's capabilities and decrease our partner capabilities, we'll get to some new balance. This, incidentally, is the same approach, I think, that the administration, same individuals that occupied similar positions in the Obama administration, it's the same approach I believe they've taken toward Israel and Palestine, wherein we would decrease Israel's capabilities and ability to deal with the Palestinian terrorist threat, increase the Palestinian position, and this would bring us to some sort of détente. And so we're seeing this play out at a strategic level. That belief informs their policy approach. And we have subordinated all other policy decisions and all other national security objectives to that. And the problem, of course, is that belief is based on flawed assumptions. It's not valid. And if we listen to our partners in the region, they would all tell us, as they have, exactly the same thing. At the end of the day, they're left to deal with the consequences, and we're likely to see an expansion to the already ongoing arms race in both the conventional and potentially in the WMD sense in the near term as a result of our abrogation, our inability to check Iran's capabilities that Andrea mentioned before as they get to zero breakout and threshold status. And I agree with her and colleagues at FDD that I would not be surprised if they were to get to the point where they would attempt to test within the next 6 months, because our track record on this has been 100% wrong. We've never been able to anticipate any emerging threat, or even our partners and allies, for that matter, attempt to obtain nuclear weapons capability. And I think that our loss of visibility and our lack of visibility in so many areas of Iran's program are key here, which is why Andrea's point about the NPT violations, the lack of verification, and the failure to meet the safeguards probe is not a historic issue. It is a current one. If in fact they never stop their program, if in fact that program continues, it's important to know that. It's not a matter of historic relevance, it's a matter of current relevance. And if we're going to undertake an agreement with Iran, we ought to make sure that there's some level of trust. And I don't think we have any basis for that trust. And I don't think we ever have. So at the end of the day, I think we're likely to see a couple of things. First is, as I said, there's likely to be an arms race and proliferation risk growing. The likelihood of regional conflict and escalation is important. And because of that, I think we ought to take every step that we can to support Israel's efforts to normalize and support Israel's relations with those that have normalized diplomatic relations recently with the Abraham Accords. I think it's critical that we do so, and that pouring cement around that bulwark or in some way safeguard our interest and theirs as we enter a period of unprecedented risk in the Middle East.
Rob, let me stick with you for a couple of seconds here, just to follow up on a couple of things you said. One of them is the issue of the Abraham Accords. When you say that we should be facilitating the expansion, strengthening of the Abraham Accords, are you stressing primarily the military value of normalization, or do you see this simply the normalization itself and economic interaction as part of the bulwark?
Right. So they're interrelated. Our approach was to build an economic relationship between countries that had shared and convergent interests and capabilities.
Sorry, 1 second, Rob. Let me just, I didn't go into lengthy bios at the beginning. Let me just say for our viewers out there, when you say our approach, you were the senior advisor to President Trump on the Middle East. And so is that what you mean when you say our?
Yeah, the previous administration approach, of which I was a part, our approach was behind the Abraham Accords was to connect these countries on an economic basis so that, having been so integrated, that they would defend that interest because it was in their economic, it was tied to their future prosperity. And so the logic was not security first, economic second. The logic was very much economic first, security then second. Because again, that foundation, that logic had to presume. You look at it in contrast with 79 in Egypt and 94 with Jordan, it was a security first, economic second approach. And in the process, it costs the United States in particular a significant amount of resources in order to maintain it. I think it's a good investment, by the way, but our approach was decidedly different, and it doesn't cost the United States. And I think it'll be more durable as a result. And so I think that has to be invested in what is already created. And I think the expansion of it is logical, and I think is something that we should prioritize without a doubt.
One other question for you, Rob. I think a lot of people, you mentioned that there's this belief, assumption in the White House that by strengthening Iran, we're going to get to some kind of equilibrium. And this is, I think, hard for a lot of people to grasp, including a lot of, I would say, diehard Democrats. The administration doesn't come out and openly say that. You can glean that here and there from some statements, particularly statements by the former President Obama. But how do you think that they have arrived at this notion that this is the way to reach an equilibrium, and we will achieve it, and it'll be good for the United States?
Look, I think first it comes from a frustration of having such a significant presence, U.S. blood and treasure expended in the region, especially since the results and our response to 9/11. So I think first there was a recognition that it was not sustainable to have a significant U.S. presence in the region. Second, I think there's an ongoing debate across the political spectrum in the United States about our enduring national security interests in the region. And third, I think that there's been, let's say, a lack of enthusiasm for our support of traditional partners and allies in the region and the expense associated with it. And you tie all of that together, and I think it was a desperate search for alternatives. And I think it's valid, and I think it's wise to pursue alternatives. I think those that adhere to this belief landed in the wrong place. And they did because, in my judgment, it just doesn't comport with the available facts or experience in the region, which is why I think if we listen to our partners who live there, we would, I think, universally hear and have heard from them that this approach is not sustainable. And again, looking for alternatives is not a bad one, which is strength and capability among our partners and allies in the region to a far greater extent, and enable them to wield a much greater capability, and to do that by integrating with each other. So an extension of the normalization efforts with Israel was our project to introduce what we call the Middle East Strategic Alliance, but is really just a regional enduring security architecture that integrates our partners and allies in the region to deal with the host of threats, including Iran, much more effectively.
Thanks. Jonathan, let's bring you in on this. I do want to get your view on where this equilibrium notion comes from. But before we do that, could you just give us a little bit of a sense? I think nobody on this call understands the Israeli point of view better than you do. Can you give us a sense of how you see the Israelis reading this? And it looks like it's 5 minutes to midnight right now, and I'm not hearing the Israelis saying that. Why is that?
So thank you, Mike, and I'm delighted to join you and our other colleagues for this call today. I think that's the answer to that question, or series of questions, is pretty dense. So I think that, going to Rob's point about the region, I think that when the countries of the Middle East, especially in the Gulf, they look at the United States, not even just over the past decade, but really since 9/11, they see sort of a United States Middle East policy or collection of policies that is very fitful, right? So it's up and down, and it's in and it's out. And I think that the inconsistency of it is part of what has driven their thinking and their decision making until this point. And what we're seeing now is exactly the hedging that Rob is talking about. So you see them talking more with China and talking more with Russia, and talking more with each other in ways that people had ruled out as, it's impossible. It could never be that, this Middle Eastern country and that Middle Eastern country would speak with each other. And now it looks like everybody is in some way speaking with each other, including with Iran, because that's also part of the way they're hedging their bets. I think Israel is different in the sense that Israel is also speaking to its neighbors, but it can't speak to Iran. Israel can't go. Is not going to send somebody to Iran to try and figure out how to work out this nuclear misunderstanding. But the other countries have been doing that. So Israel has to rely on the United States in ways that I think the other countries also do, but with fewer alternatives, and it has to rely on itself. I think this has gotten this sort of crashed into the domestic politics in Israel right now, because the current prime minister and his predecessor, I think, have been working very hard to prove who they aren't. And so the model that they're using is say, you know what, the Netanyahu government took this confrontational approach with the Obama administration, particularly on the nuclear deal. We're not going to do that. We're going to take a cooperative approach. And what they're doing now is they're saying, oh, and look at the tremendous success we've had. The Israelis are saying that they convinced the Americans not to delist the IRGC from the foreign terrorist thing, and along the way that also made it more difficult to go back to the nuclear deal. I think that the U.S. decision not to delist the IRGC, insofar as it is valid and still in force, was based on U.S. considerations, including U.S. primarily, I would say, the U.S. domestic considerations. There were a couple of times where White House spokespeople were asked how much influence the Israelis were having on decision making, and the answer was very frank. It was zero. It was the Israelis are not, in fact, influencing that decision making. I think also there's some historical revisionism going on, in the sense that in Israel, I should say especially in Israel, but also in the United States as well, people talk about Netanyahu and his approach to the nuclear thing as if he started with the speech in Congress. He started with this confrontation. I heard people even in 2015 say, why is the prime minister making this speech? It's so public. Why doesn't he tell the president his concerns, behind closed doors and quietly, so that they can, the Israel and the United States can work this out? But the Israeli policy didn't begin with this public confrontation. It ended with this public confrontation precisely because the prime minister did make these arguments, did make them quietly, did make them behind closed doors, and the result was that Israel's concerns about the nuclear deal, which have been borne out over time, were ignored and cast aside, and the deal just got progressively worse. And of course, the administration at the time also misled the Israelis about what, in fact, they were even doing with Iran from the beginning. So I think that's part of what's going on in Israel right now, whether or not, but at the same time, I should say, the Israeli prime ministers, whether it's Lapid or Bennett or Netanyahu, have all consistently said that they oppose the JCPOA. They think it's a bad deal, and they think that going back into it is a mistake.
So do you agree with Rob's understanding of where this equilibrium notion comes from? Do you have any thoughts? I mean, for me, it's the strangest thing. I have my own views about it, of course, but it is the strangest thing because there, as Rob said, I'm putting words in Rob's mouth, but the evidentiary base for the existence of this equilibrium is incredibly absent in the mind of everyone except those who believe in it. But they make no effort to show how it's going to happen. They just seem to somehow know it. And I wonder if you have any insight into that.
So I agree with both of you in that I think during the Obama years, the president himself was much more explicit about this notion. He talked about sharing the region. He talked about balance. I remember, to Rob's point about Palestinians, I remember President Obama gave an interview, I think it was in the New York Times, where he talked about how one of the problems was that Netanyahu was too strong and Abu Mazen was too weak, and sort of, if only this would change, that the whole dynamic would change. I think Obama had in many ways, revolutionary vision for the Middle East. I don't know that Biden shares that revolutionary vision. You certainly don't see those kinds of quotes coming from President Biden. And then I think the open question is, to what extent does the circle of advisors that they share, that were in the Obama administration and are now in the Biden administration, share that sort of revolutionary view? What I think also helps us understand the approach, and it was interesting because this I saw as the JCPOA was being negotiated and then justified after it had been concluded. And you would hear this much more explicitly from European countries than you would from the US administration, I think because of the political digestibility of it. But the approach was, it's funny, you lay out the terms of the JCPOA to a neutral audience, or an audience that's learning about it for the first time, and they actually can't believe it, right? They're like, we did what, right? Like they can't, like, so you lay it out, and often I met with skepticism. They say that can't be. How is it possible that the US and the E3 agreed to do this, this, and this, and for only this amount of time, and with these limits? Okay, so you say, why would they do that? And what the Europeans would tell you is that this was supposed to be a temporary solution, and that by engaging Iran diplomatically and economically, eventually they'd see the light, and as we've heard so many times, would join the community of nations, and then the idea was they wouldn't even think or that they had a need for nuclear weapons or anything like that. And I think that is a big part of what was driving this in the United States as well. But like I said, I don't think there's a lot of appetite for that sort of explanation in the American political discourse.
Right. Right. Well, thanks. Andrea, back to you. I put words in your mouth a minute ago when I was talking to Rob, and I said that you said that this was kneecapping the IAEA. This, I mean, the concessions regarding the possible military dimensions of the program that have been presented to the IAEA, and which it is actively investigating. The suggestion or the proposal from the EU to close those files. I assume, first of all, it's a question. I assume you agree that will actually kneecap the IAEA. And I wonder if you could walk us through the current director of the IAEA. He seems to be pretty keen on pursuing these investigations. How do you imagine if the Iranians accept this proposal, he will respond and the Board of Governors will respond to him?
Sure. I think, on the IAEA's investigation, I'd be very surprised if, when it comes down to it, Washington and Europe would force a showdown with Iran and say, look, you have to provide truthful answers before the deal could be re-implemented. I mean, they've set the precedent already in 2015. They got away with it then. So I think, and Tehran has said very clearly that unless the probe is closed, it won't restart a new deal. So I think, to your point, it puts Rafael Grossi in a very tough position. He has said very clearly there's no political solution, but at the same time, what is he really realistically able to do if the Board of Governors votes to close the investigation? I'm still asking contacts whether they think there's more he could do privately, whether he could say, well, we'll revisit these questions later. I don't see any other option if he's really gung-ho about this, but to resign. And I don't think that's likely to happen. So he may try to couch this as he's following the board's decision, but the case isn't closed for him. But, this is very troubling for non-proliferation efforts. We have a state sponsor of terrorism that we know for a fact, because of the Nuclear Archive, had a crashed nuclear weapons program. They plan to keep it going, and they'd be able to get away with it again. And of course, they could continue their covert progress on weaponization and missile delivery while in the JCPOA, and then emerge in a few years with really a technical unstoppability, the nuclear threshold status that we talked about, to go for the bomb.
Andrea, this 60% to which they've enriched the uranium, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no technical or non-military purpose behind that. I'm saying if the Iranians wanted to have a fig leaf to hide behind, there's no legitimate purpose for doing that other than a bomb. Am I wrong?
Right. No one uses 60% enriched uranium in reactors, for example. And I think they had said in the past that they might go to 60 as a step toward going higher in order to make fuel for nuclear submarines. But, they don't have that technology at all. So it is just a pretext to go further.
And one of the things that's been interesting to me is there's more and more in the Iranian, not directly from the highest officials, but from people around them, there's more and more open talk about getting a nuclear weapon. I mean, they're not even hiding behind the fig leaf of the non-existent fatwa anymore. Is that right?
That's right. And the fatwa you mentioned, is supposedly the supreme leader said it's forbidden under Islam to make nuclear weapons, but no one has ever seen this fatwa. It was never apparently published. There was a website about it, but they took it down. And fatwas are apparently changeable. So, they're talking. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, what was interesting was, if you go back to the IAEA reports up to and through 2015, it was like pieces of a puzzle. And so, the IAEA is very careful, and they write in sort of legalistic language about what they have and what they don't see. And you get these sort of sentences like, what we're seeing is consistent with a military nuclear program, but, it doesn't actually come out and say. So it always felt like you had these pieces of a puzzle. And then when you get the nuclear archive, I remember the first time I looked at those materials, I was like, this is the solution to the puzzle, right? You were looking at the whole puzzle completed. You're looking at the designs and plans for an Iranian nuclear weapon. And I think, to Andrea's point, I think the difference between what the IAEA can do now and what they could do in 2015 is different, because in 2015 they didn't have, first of all, they didn't have the archive, and second, the particles, the uranium that they've discovered, and that the investigations are open about, are particles that the IAEA itself has discovered. And so I think that the threat to the independence and the professional side of the IAEA is very, very grave. Would you agree with that, Andrea?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you've been working this issue for years. So, yep, totally agree. It's a very negative prospect that the small might be, shoved under the rug once again.
So this would, Andrea, if the director were to resign, or to be publicly seen to be capitulating to pressure from the greatest powers on earth, this would have a deep demoralizing effect on people working at the IAEA. Is that how you would read it?
I would say so. They did quite a bit of work from 2002 to 2015. If they don't have the support of world powers, then they don't have any reason to get access to sites. They don't have the pressure on Iran to answer their questions. They may not even get Iran to meet with them in the future about these issues. So it's a real problem.
This is an amazing story, Rob. It's absolutely amazing. There's no, all of the, the thing I find most amusing about it, if I can be amused by this sad story, is that all of the supposed justifications for the JCPOA back in 2015 that the Obama administration put forward, they have pretty much all melted away. We're not getting a more moderate Iran. The chance that we're going to find an equilibrium in the Middle East is about nil. There's certainly nothing the administration can point to an open-minded, fair-minded observer to say that we're going to get equilibrium as these guys get stronger. The regime itself is pretty much openly saying it's going for a bomb, and yet we're plowing right ahead. So, what do you see at this point? Are you totally demoralized, or do you still see a way forward by which we can stop this from happening? This being Iran from achieving a nuclear weapon in the next few years?
Well, look, I've had doubt and reservation about our ability to do that through negotiations alone. And I would say at the moment, I don't think that there's a viable path forward to prevent what Iran seems committed to do through our current course and the pursuit of return to an expiring deal. And I also think we've eroded our deterrence. The drone assault on Atom garrison in Syria is just the latest in a string of examples of how we, by I think all the observable facts, no longer have deterrence. And I don't think we can adequately defend our own interests in the region, let alone our partners and allies. And again, recognizing that global markets are incredibly important to the economy, that the global economy we help create and we're the chief beneficiaries of. Look, no matter how you look at this, we are we are definitely at 5 minutes to midnight. The question then for all of us is, what do we do at this point? Whether or not Iran, answers in response to the EU text and, by midnight tonight in the next couple of hours, and I don't think that they will. I think they'll continue to string it out because they can, and it's in their interests. I think we are getting to the point where we're going to have to pursue alternatives. And I think it comes down to fundamentally addressing this threat with our partners and allies in lockstep, not pursuing an alternative path, not pursuing one independent of our regional partners, but arm in arm with our regional partners. And I think we need to starve Iran of the resources that it is taking advantage of to threaten the United States on U.S. soil, as well as in the region and our partners and allies. And I think at this point, we need to restore military deterrence and ensure that in their minds that we are not going to hesitate to use the military instrument if we have no other resort available. And I think we're getting very, very close to that point.
Jonathan, when our partners and allies in the region look at our policy and are demoralized by it, how do you think they're going to respond? Is there any possibility, in particular with regard to the Israelis, but not only them, is there any possibility of some of them stepping up and taking increased action against Iran in the absence of an American effort to restore its deterrence, as Rob is describing?
Yeah, I think before I answer that, just to your question about how the supposed advantages of the deal have sort of melted away, it reminds me of the folks who used to defend the Soviet Union as it was, crumbling and falling apart. They say, well, of course, communism is fine. They're just doing it wrong, right? So now it's the same kind of thing. Like, well, the JCP is terrific. It's just that, well, Trump did this, or it was never fully that, and they never enjoyed the benefits, and so on. Like, I mean, it's the same kind of sort of silly non-argument. I agree with Rob, by the way. I think in some ways, I feel like whether or not an agreement is struck in Vienna tonight, tomorrow, or next week, whether or not they go back to the JCPOA, and it's actually a question I'd love to hear Andrea address. For all the talk about returning to the JCPOA, given all of the progress that they've made, is there even a return to the JCPOA? But even if there is, it feels like in any case, the United States and others are going to have to start looking at what's next. Because even if you go back to the JCPOA tomorrow, it's still, the problem with the JCPOA was always that it doesn't solve the nuclear problem, and it's getting closer and it's getting more urgent. So what is the next step? And I agree with Rob. So far, we're not hearing that. To your question, Mike, Israel's consistent policy across governments, across prime ministers, has been that Israel will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. So what that means, I think I'll leave to the Israelis to spell out. But I think that in many ways, the absence of the United States posing a credible military threat makes a military threat from others much more likely, not less likely.
Andrea, perhaps you want to respond to what Jonathan said, and I have a related question, but go ahead and respond to Jonathan, if you will.
Sure, I think that's a great point, that the deal really can't put back Iran's progress into a box. 7 years have gone by. They've made hundreds of advanced centrifuges. I think Israel is estimating that under a revived deal, the breakout time, which is the amount of time it would take Iran to make enough enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon, it would be 4 to 6 months, rather than the Obama administration claimed it was a year under the JCPOA. So also the JCPOA would put a cap on the amount of enriched uranium Iran can possess and limits on the enrichment purity it can achieve. But they've made so many advanced centrifuges, and they'll reportedly just be forced to put them in storage. So they could overcome these caps more rapidly if they wanted to. And then the deal, it just allows the program to expand over the next few years. They can make more advanced centrifuges, put them in storage, but then add key equipment that would make them operational in 2027. So the threat, it will expand under the deal. It's not like a Soviet arms control agreement where we're putting caps that you have to renegotiate at the end. This actually allows the program to grow. So that's a great point.
Andrea, my last question to you on this, with respect to the nuclear threshold, they have right now the capacity to enrich uranium to weaponized levels within a matter of weeks, if I'm not mistaken. But what do we know about their ability to put that material into a warhead and put a warhead on ballistic missiles. How far? What are the reigning assumptions in your community, and what facts are those assumptions based on?
Well, we know a lot more based on the nuclear archive materials. We've seen that they've done quite a bit on weaponization. They had a nuclear weapon design. They had a series of bottlenecks in the weaponization process that they had not overcome by 2003. And because it would be so secretive if activities are ongoing, very little is known. So I think in Israel and in Washington, they have to sort of extrapolate and guess what the progress would be. And they haven't seen too many signs of what's going on. We know that Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, he was an assassinated atomic scientist. He was overseeing an entity called SPND by the Persian acronym, and they were supposedly carrying out these weaponization activities. The US sanctioned them in 2014 and then sanctioned additional entities and people in 2019. So at the same time, we're saying, well, we don't know if the weaponization program continues. We see evidence of it going on in the nuclear archive, planning to continue it. I think that's what leads the good ISIS and David Albright to say they could probably explode a nuclear device within 6 months. You know, whether they would want to acquire more enriched uranium to be able to break out, I would say probably yes. They would probably want more than enough for 5 weapons, which is what they have now. But, you know, it just depends on how desperate they are, how quickly they would want to go forward. But they certainly seem to have time to go forward if they want.
Rob, you know, you've sat in the seat where you've had to advise a president on this issue, a president who was not eager to get into a conflict with Iran. I think it's fair to say, and if he had an obvious way out of conflict, would have taken it. If we were to put you in the room with Joe Biden now, and you were to advise him, knowing full well all of the political pressure on him not to go down the conflict route, and it's, you know, on a Democratic president with a progressive base, and it's even more intense than it was on Donald Trump. What are the kind of simple steps that you would advise him to take to begin to restore the credibility of the United States, the credibility of its deterrence that you mentioned a minute ago?
Sure. The first, I think, and the most important is to safeguard U.S. interests in the region, which is an obligation. We need to introduce sufficient capacity back into the region that we've been assiduously pulling out for uninterrupted for almost the last 10 years, to the point where we probably have the least amount of capabilities in the Middle East that we've had in decades, at a time when, as we were talking about now, risk is increasing, not decreasing. So first and foremost, we need to reintroduce capabilities sufficient to defend and protect our own interests. I'd add to it that a lot of those interests are our physical infrastructure, military and diplomatic alike, but also our partners and allies' economic assets. I think the last thing anyone, including this current administration, wants to see is a precipitous climb in gasoline or oil prices because Iran decides again to launch a unilateral attack against Saudi's oil infrastructure or other regional oil infrastructure. So that has to be defended, and we can't currently do that adequately. Number two is in order to, over the long term, to make this feasible so that the U.S. isn't there in perpetuity at tremendous expense, we have to really invest in making our partners and allies a lot more efficient, not just individually, which is, again, I think prudent. And these are paying customers, by the way, unlike a lot of our commitments in other parts of the world. And second, we need to integrate them. It's the difference between putting individual players on the field and putting a team on the field. And there's no question, I think, in anyone's mind, certainly not in mine, is that we need to put a team on the field, just as we've done in Europe and in instances in Asia. And so I think that's ultimately required to safeguard our interests. That's even if we were to pursue a negotiated path to return to the JCPOA. If that remained a policy objective, we still have to address this enormous gap in our risk. and restore credible military deterrence against our own threats, but also those of our partners and allies and global energy infrastructure. And then second is all the facts now support the conclusion, I think, that there is not going to be a diplomatic resolution to this problem, even if we return to the deal, as Andrea pointed out, as Jonathan mentioned, and other experts have, that's still, the blanket is still too short for the bed. We're going to have to come out a way to reconcile this, and that has to be done. And there needs to be a plan in order to do it. And all of the consensus judgments for these many years has concluded that Iran responds to two things: existential military threat and significant economic pressure. And those two things are intimately related. They're both the regime survival issues. And only under those circumstances will they reverse course on a significant decision of this magnitude. And we have withdrawn both. So we have to return both of those in order to obtain an outcome that meets our interests and our partners and allies in the region. And if we don't take those steps to reintroduce capabilities, make our partners more capable, and to begin to reapply pressure to get Iran to change its course, then we're going to be left with a circumstance where at the conclusion of a test, we have to basically assume they can deliver the weapon that they've tested, and they would then have this blanket of impunity, which I think the current supreme leader, knowing his time on this earth is running thankfully short, is mindful of. And the fact that he thinks a fragile Israeli coalition government headed into elections yet again, and a U.S. government committed to negotiations, not confrontation, he may well be judging that this is the best chance he'll ever have to ensure regime survival by obtaining a weapon. It worked for Russia, it works for North Korea, and it didn't work in Ukraine's case, where they promised to give up their weapons, did so, and now are reaping the lack of security that the West provided them. So I think that all the lessons are pointing to us to pay close attention to the fact that Iran may well be committed to pursuing a path to developing a weapon. We should assume that's the case.
I was going to make this your last word, but you just what your comments have sparked a question in my mind. So let me go ahead and ask it. There's a view out there in the Middle East analysis community that not one I ascribe to, by the way, but that Iran doesn't actually want a bomb. That it just wants to be one turn of the key away, and that actually having the weapon is going to cause more problems for it than not. I hear you saying two things, which I think are interesting. One, of course, they want the bomb, but also once they have the capacity to test, they will test. That they won't see any downside to testing. Is that right?
Yeah, look, they're eminently practical. I understand the argument. I also don't agree with it, because at the end of the day, the benefit of having a capability is proving it. You have to be able to prove you have the capability. If there's doubt, like there is in deterrence, then it's not deterrence. And if you have a weapon capability, you don't test it, then it's speculative, and that doubt could seed action. And what I think they're keen to do is prevent anyone from attacking them. And they have seen time and again, the only way to do that is to possess a nuclear weapon. And that has worked for North Korea, it works for Russia, and it works for other states in the same predicament. And and I think in their minds would ensure regime survival. And so I think that they don't want to get to just turnkey. I think they would if they thought that met their objectives. But I think at this point, they've concluded that it doesn't. And because our positions wax and wane with the change of administrations, I think their goal is to ensure survivability through their possession and demonstration of a capability.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let me put the same questions to you. If I could get you in the room with President Biden, and again, understanding fully the pressures that he's under, what are some of the steps that you would like to see him take?
I think my answer is very similar to Rob's. I think one thing I think that is very important. Even in advance of the president's trip to the region, there was all this talk about putting together a regional air defense alliance, looking at the missile and drone threat out of Iran, and it was. I think the defense piece is important, and I agree with Rob. If we can get a team out there instead of just individual players, I think that's more effective. I think the incorporation of Israel into CENTCOM is a positive development in that regard. I think if the United States is in a position to facilitate that greater coordination and cooperation on air defense, of course, that's a positive thing. My concern is that, you know, the U.S. was talking this up, and the Israelis were talking it up in advance of the president's trip, but it's so focused on defense, and there was so little talk about deterrence, as Rob was talking about, that I worry about the message. Is the message that we have to, you know, now we have to come to terms with the Iranian missile threat, and that's just how it is. But it's actually worse than that, because at the same time the U.S. is pushing a return to the JCPOA lifts the missile embargo on Iran, not in 10 years, but next year, right? About 14 months from now. So you and I were talking about it. To me, it looks like it's like a drug dealer offering to open a rehab clinic. It's like, here we're gonna pump the market full of Iranian, you know, we're gonna boost the Iranian missile threat, but we'll give you some missile defense along the way. It just it strikes me as sending a very dangerous message. So my advice would be that you have to you know, you have to strengthen the defense message, but you also have to strengthen the deterrence message. I think the message that Rob was talking about and the examples he gave were very apt. So I think the Iranians, they look at Gaddafi, and they look at Saddam Hussein, and they look at the Ukrainian example, and they draw conclusions. And I think also, very frankly, they look at Taiwan, which had its own nuclear weapons program in the 1980s that the United States pressured them out of. And look where Taiwan is today. I mean, look how we're talking about Taiwan today vis-a-vis the Chinese threat. Obviously, no analogy is perfect, and I don't mean to suggest that these things are all cookie cutters that apply. But I think if you're Iran and you're in charge of the Iranian nuclear weapons program, and again, it's a nuclear weapons program, and you know, to support the JCPOA, you have to pretend that it's not. I think that the conclusions they would draw would be very alarming. And I think, again, if I'm talking to the president and say, look, I understand the political pressures you're under, but the path you're on now is going to make not just war more likely, it's going to make a nuclear arms race more likely. And so now is the time not to take not to follow the lead of progressives in your base, but to actually lead by showing them that this is the way toward a safer, more secure, and more peaceful outcome.
Just to make everybody feel really, really good, let me remind them that Rob Greenway, if I'm not mistaken, Rob, you'll correct me, your entire career was spent in the Middle East as a military officer. Is that right?
Correct.
So when Rob Greenway says that our current Rob Greenway, career military officer, before he worked in policy, when he says that our capabilities are at an all-time low, that's the opinion of a very serious and knowledgeable expert. Andrea, as our distinguished guest, you get the last word here. You can give some advice to Joe Biden, or you can leave us with whatever thoughts you have on your mind.
Well, I would just like to give people the warning that FDD is estimating that Iran will get around $275 billion in the first year of the JCPOA alone. At the same time,
275 billion?
Yeah, that's what we're estimating, that that total is comprised of unfrozen assets, oil revenue, lowered import costs just during the first year.
But Andrea, there's a lot of inflation out there.
So it could be more.
Well, that's not that much, really.
Or less. But without meaningfully addressing the nuclear threat, halting assassination plots on U.S. soil, or stopping any attacks on our troops and our partners in the Middle East, among other reasons for not giving, a terror sponsoring state access to large amounts of funds. So I would suggest to President Biden, back out now, get the policy correct this time. Don't go for what's easy just because it will delay a bomb perhaps by a couple of years while he's in office, and let go of this Obama legacy issue. We have to address the Iran threat holistically this time.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks to all of you out there listening. This has been a very informative discussion. Not very uplifting. I'm not leaving in a better mood than the one I came with, but I guess not all Hudson events can be sweetness and light. Thanks a lot.